And I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to play from the start. And I'm the only one on here. I mean, I'm obviously not the only one on here, but I'm moderating this. So everybody knows the Zoom sort of protocol. If you can just try to keep muted. I do want to hear from you. It was great to just hear some voices of friends just now. But if you can keep muted, there will be spot for Q&A and discussion at the end. Also, please use the chat. That's been a great way to keep track of people's questions and comments, even if we don't get to them. I also have a short poll that will follow, and I'll put that in the chat. Remind me if I forget, because I have some links to help sort of take next steps. So I want to get started. See if I can. There we go. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you made it. I hope you're all feeling as pumped as I am to talk about regionalism. I invited you here today as friends and colleagues and Detroiters and even some family, I think. So I think I know most of you here. That's why you're here. But there may be some I don't know. So I'll give you a short bio. That's me before COVID. I still had long hair, not quite as long as what's happened since. I am your host today. I'm an urbanist. I grew up in Detroit. I went to New York for college and work during most of the 1990s into the early aughts before moving back in 2001. My academic background includes architectural history, urban planning, and the law. And I've tried to synthesize this under this sort of rubric of urbanism. I believe cities are civilization's greatest achievement, and most of society's problems can be found in them, but also society's solutions. By day, I'm a consultant. I work at a solo practice, Paris of the Midwest, mostly on community and policy issues and engagement in Detroit and for Detroiters. And the rest of the time, I often find myself noodling on projects like this. So lucky you for joining me today. Today, I thought I'd share a version of a presentation I did in May for the Environmental Design Research Association, EDRA. It was hosted by UDM and Wayne State for their Creating Just Societies track. And some of you may have attended or even presented, or in the case of Lauren, who I think I saw pop in here, was a plenary speaker. So we've got some pretty fancy people on this call. I was just one of the first presenters in the first session. So now that we're back in the world, I wanted to give this presentation, which I had hoped to use as a test run back in April, but like COVID and procrastination. So thanks for letting me get this in before the summer really starts. I have just over half an hour of material, and then I'd love to get your feedback and questions. I will do my best to stop us at 4 unless there's, a few remaining questions. We can definitely follow up, and as Chase and others have suggested, I would love to see you in person in the coming weeks and months. I encourage you to post and chat. Please message with each other. Again, it's just me moderating, so we'll try to keep questions until I'm done. This topic of regionalism, and in my case, what that means is imagining a governance approach to Southeastern Michigan. And that is to say how the over 100 local units of government relate to Detroit and to each other. It's been something that's been near and dear to my heart for a couple of decades now, but it's been quite an enigma to me. And for a lot of other people, I think, who care about this issue. I think most people wrapping their head around local government is, something of a snooze fest. It's an arcane topic, and government gets a bad enough rap these days. It's harder to get people to meaningfully engage in local government in a way that gets beyond the issues of the day, much less inspire in their imagination ideas about how to change it or a path that we can take to get there. So here goes. This is my sort of take on it. I believe local government is fundamentally broken in the United States, especially in large metro areas. It's wasteful. It causes inequity, infighting, and in a larger frame is not a proper representation of a local economy, which in my mind is a sounder rationale for who and what local government should be serving. So to begin, here's a question for everyone. Do you know the number of local units of government that impact your life on a daily basis? This definition can include any taxing jurisdiction or special district. It can also, so that's not just the city, town, or township, but also include in that your local school district or water district, drainage district. Most of us are from Detroit or Metro Detroit, so that number is probably similar. But if you don't mind, put it in the chat. And if you don't know, share your best guess. You might be surprised how quickly the numbers add up. You might also be surprised by the fact that you have absolutely no idea. There's a lot of people collecting taxes, and that's okay. This might be the support group for you. As a citizen of Detroit, I pay taxes to the city of Detroit, obviously. And included in that is money for elected bodies, overseeing schools, police, fire, water, sort of basic services, libraries. But I also support Wayne County as a stadium district, a stadium authority, I should say, sheriff, road commission, jails, parks, local courts. So a lot. Across the United States, there are 40,000 general purpose districts. These are your cities, towns, and villages, and over 51,000 special districts. As states go, Michigan isn't the worst, but it's pretty bad. It ranks 7th in the country with 1,856 general purpose districts and over 1,000 special purpose districts. Illinois has the most at 2,828. And here's the thing, when put in a regional context, we start multiplying the situation across numerous local borders, jurisdictions, and service areas. And greater population density does not necessarily correlate with a reduction in the number of local units of government. So, as a citizen of Southeastern Michigan, my neighbors across the street, as well as 20 miles away, may just be as likely to have both the same and local governments involved in their life as me. In fact, the average metropolitan area consists of 114 local governments. There are 18 local governments for every 100,000 people in the metropolitan areas in the United States. So for a place like Detroit, here's how it can play out on ground level. These are just hypotheticals. They may have some basis in fact or not. I just sort of created them for the presentation, but to give you an idea, 8 Mile Road divides a dozen municipalities across its 20-mile stretch. There are 3 counties, and you can stand at 8 Mile and look at 3 cities and 3 counties on 3 of the 4 corners of that intersection. And which of the 6 police and fire departments will respond to a car crash at that intersection? Is maintaining 6 separate departments for 1 accident an efficient use of public resources? Or what about the kid, 10-year-old kid living on the east side of Detroit in a house on Alter Road in the Detroit Public Schools District? His nearest school, the Detroit Merit Charter Academy, tested 24% math and 36% English of the statewide average. And just across Alter, the same distance away, kids at Grosse Pointe Park's Defer Elementary tested 74% math and 64% English. How is that a fair shake for a kid whose only fault is living on the wrong side of the street? Or what about, the Syrian refugee whose life has been turned upside down over the last decade due to civil war and never learned to drive? She just scored a job as a graduate assistant in the chemistry department at Wayne State. Unfortunately, she was settled in Livonia, whose elected leaders opted out of a regional bus system, ironically named SMART. It connects many, but not all communities in Southeast Michigan. Apparently, it's the only one in the country whose state enabling legislation allows municipalities to opt out. How is that helping the economy? These are just three illustrative examples. I don't even think they're the best, but they give you an idea of how our local politics serve to undermine what might be greater aspirations, and how we've literally made our region into one of the most segregated in the country. I'm not telling so many of you new information, but how can we not afford to design our environment of local citizenship and government to be more just when the status quo is so wasteful and so inequitable? We know our region trends on the bad end of the spectrum, but many other metro areas across the country suffer from what is generally called in the literature metro fragmentation, where a multiplicity of municipalities fight politically over what becomes a smaller and smaller piece of economic pie. Myron Orfield, the director of the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity at the University of Minnesota, finds that that less fragmented regions do better economically than more fragmented ones. This is a chart from the London-based Center for Economic Policy, which shows that having more local units of government does not serve the productivity of its citizens. This singular problem has been identified for over half a century, possibly more. It's important to remember historically that cities like Detroit simply annexed surrounding communities or consolidated as they grew to keep tax base and services centrally located and controlled. New York famously consolidated in 1898, much to the dismay of many. Here's some jaunty illustrations from that time. One shows the Tammany Tiger, New York's egregiously corrupt political machine at the time, sucking resources from surrounding communities. The other sort of comically and misogynistically image shows a bunch of petty patriarchy vainly trying to defend the honor of Brooklyn against an old money marriage proposal from New York City. But it kind of looks like she knows what she wants. And over 100 years later, New York City, I would argue, is better for it. That's more or less how Detroit grew. It grew through annexation over its first 2 centuries, especially up through the early decades of the 20th century. About that time as well, the codification of what's known as home rule in Michigan, the Constitution, and other states made it more possible for more places to self-determine, incorporate, and then push back against annexation. And here lies the real tension of our local government system in the US. While most legal scholars agree that ultimate power rests with the state, the degree to which a place can manage its own affairs falls along some spectrum between state and local control. And if you're ever into learning more about this, you can blame these two guys, these old white guys, Dillon and Cooley, and that's, yes, the Cooley Law School Cooley, who wrote treatises as judges and scholars and ruled on the subject in the late 19th century. Michigan's constitution, which was last updated in 1963, is permissive about regional government, but it's not prescriptive. And we know how much folks like to give up power, so I don't necessarily see that changing anytime soon. There's a lot on this topic, and suffice to say, many older cities in the Northeast and Midwest that grew through annexation got bogged down over time as existing surrounding communities incorporated and resisted annexation, often for reasons of racism. Other cities and states who don't follow home rule as strictly or didn't have as much early development, many in the South and West, continue to use annexation and consolidation to capture tax base, even when people move further and further away. So it's incredible to think how and compare some of these geographies. Look at these images. This is Detroit inside Wayne County at 670,000 people or so, and about 140 square miles. You can also see the other municipalities in Wayne County. Here's an image of Houston, I think. There we go, which is 672 square miles, and 5 Detroits could fit inside it, even though it has only 3 times the number of people as Detroit. And then Jacksonville, which is kind of an outlier, but interesting to compare, has half the population of Houston, but is even bigger at 874 square miles, and it takes up pretty much that entire county. Other places like Indianapolis and Boston and Denver, and other places that gave me an excuse to look up what their maps look like, have worked over the years to formalize regional systems to some degree. Probably the poster child that many of you know is Portland, Oregon. It's the only regional government that's elected in the country. It's known as Metro, and it's famous for that reason. It has land use. It oversees land use, transportation planning, solid waste management, and owns and operates regional assets like the Convention Center and Expo Center and Zoo and the Center for Performing Arts. And they're actually really hot right now. More on that a little later. And in recognition of Canada Day, which is today, I believe, I'd point out that Canadians also have a really interesting approach to regionalism. Just over 20 years ago, in a power that US states are really loath to test, as I was sort of outlining above, this progressive conservative party, so sort of center-right party of the Ontario provincial government, over the objection of many local leaders, created the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto, part of their common sense revolution. It's a poster from that time. Despite this, Toronto's economy continues to grow year over year. This is, basically inclusive of that time. And 2020 was, not surprisingly, the only exception that the economy didn't grow. Despite these really singular efforts, and despite what many policy experts might consider best practice, unfortunately, most cities and regions in the US have some degree of dysfunction and metro fragmentation. With each degree, self-centered political fiefdoms profligate, limited resources get wasted, and inequity flourishes, and regions, I think, get less and less competitive. What I find genuinely interesting and kind of confounding, actually, is that regionalism, I think, appeals to both traditionally, we don't know what conservative or liberal really means these days, but traditionally liberal and conservative views, in that by embracing a bigger footprint of human concern, there is potentially less government in an economic ecosystem. So how do we design these spaces? I don't need to tell this group that Metro Detroit is deeply fractured by race and class. Surprisingly, though, it has something of an innovative past, at least in terms of its history of funding regional thinking. So in 1963, more than a decade after sprawl had officially become like the prevailing development model, corporate execs, along with then Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh and Governor George Romney, that's Mitt's dad, were funders and supporters of the Metropolitan Fund, which was designed to modernize regional government, in Greater Detroit. So, even executives at the auto industry whose products were, literally facilitating the growth of the suburbs could see problems with metropolitan fragmentation. Unfortunately, some bolder ideas to bring the region together would falter in the years following the riots, rebellion of 1967, and the ensuing racial and socioeconomic recalibration that redefined the region in the decades after. And while it made the case stronger for regionalism, it actually made the politics harder. So, I've been wondering much of my adult life, maybe that time to think about how we do government here has come again. It's past time, in my opinion. And, what would local government in Metro Detroit look like 50 or 100 years from now? And who's doing the work? A few minutes ago, I called people neighbors, whether they live across the street or miles away. And here's where I'd propose a reframing of local government is necessary in order to achieve not only more just society, but maybe one that's more efficient, and certainly one that offers as much personal benefit as it does common benefit. And in my view, we need a better perspective, and maybe a great big mirror too. So, here's a view from space. This is the United States, obviously. Here's a closer view of the Northeast, including Detroit. And what you're seeing here in stark terms, I think, are regional economies, like almost broadcast to the cosmos. And not surprising, it matches up to commuting patterns. These are commuting patterns, pre-COVID commuting patterns. But it's a very compelling, I think, idea. It's a very simple idea. I mean, there's not a lot to it. But I think as far as an organizing principle, it's something to consider. So here's a little closer view, blob-like as it is, of Metro Detroit. And here's what our hypotheticals look like without all those boundaries getting in the way. You have people living in a local economy who are ostensibly neighbors. All things being equal, they may just as likely cross local jurisdictions to go to work, to school, provide a service, fall in love, go out to eat, attend a sports event. You get the picture. I believe it's an apt metaphor because, as I said, it represents a local economy in clear, stark terms. Brighter areas are where we've invested in creating and managing infrastructure of life on a mass scale. It's really that simple. Some greatest rational assembly of this geography should be what we use to establish a local government, not some 18th century line of demarcation that was more relevant when distance and time were measured by horses and the sun. This is where we should build our transit system. This is the milieu where we create and manage a shared vision for land use. This is where we figure our primary education and water delivery and reinvest in drainage systems. This is the population we tax with uniform regimes for income and property and for our regional and cultural and economic assets. And while I realize that the reality of bringing another country into the mix may be, literally a bridge too far, conceptually, why not include Windsor? It's the second, together we're the second largest border region in the world. Healthcare workers from Windsor travel every day to work in one of several regional hospital facilities. Folks from Metro Detroit cross the bridge to go to University of Windsor. And these are just people I know. Thousands make the trip every day. And I understand it's far-fetched, but remember, in over 300 years of European settlement, at least that's just the last 300 years, this area has been part of 3 different countries. So I'm thinking of a long view. Getting to a job or drinking clean water or rooting for the Red Wings makes just as much sense for someone from Windsor as it does from someone from Wyandotte or Bloomfield or Mount Clemens. So how do we capture this in governance terms? Well, it turns out that the federal government recognizes regions across the country with some of the same context I use with the satellite idea. The Metropolitan Statistical Area, or MSA, it's been around for decades, mostly for census and accounting purposes. There are nearly 400 of them in the United States. The federal government also mandates MPOs, or metropolitan planning organizations, which often correspond to the footprint of MSAs. So that's ours. Except for standout regions like Portland, which we've already discussed, these bodies aren't, though, elected or proportionally representative, even when some communities contain nearly 3,000 times the population as others. So SEMCOG is our sexy sounding acronym for the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. SEMCOG could play an essential role in a move to regional governance, especially for gathering and synthesizing regional data, which is a cornerstone of any functional government. But without a clear vision leadership or directive for sustainability and equitably growing the region, SEMCOG's path seems remarkably and painfully status quo. So I'll take a moment now to acknowledge some of the folks, and several of you are on this call, which is awesome, who have been active in various parts of this space to advance important ideas, especially in recent times. Detroit Future City just hosted, just last week, its second annual Detroit Equity Conference on the heels of its the State of Economic Equity report, and launched an economic equity dashboard with data on regional economy metrics as compared to Detroit. I highly recommend checking that out for some light holiday reading. I was talking to Peter Hammer, the Key Center, where he's at. They've done some great work on with a regional lens in terms of dismantling structural racism in Metro Detroit. For years, the Michigan Suburbs Alliance sought to find common ground around the region, especially by advocating for public policy reform in Detroit's inner ring suburbs. These are just three efforts that come to mind. There have been many others, groups like Moses and True. I saw Megan on here, operate in a regional frame as well, which is, I believe the way that things should be done. One of the most inspirational events I've ever been to in terms of regionalism was when I first moved back, and Moses hosted something at Greater Grace, where all political regional leaders were sort of lined up on stage and sort of, read the riot act in terms of lack of progress on transit back at that time. And, Joel Batterman, who's on here, recently did a thesis for his PhD on the subject of SEMCOG. So it's not for lack of brains. We've got great people here thinking about this stuff actively. Perhaps a philanthropic player could underwrite a parallel effort to SEMCOG to collect data and perform research and, present a compelling case for greater regional accountability. But, as I said, that's a tough sell, but I think something like that is necessary. So regional data, it exists, but I think it could be put in this format more effectively into the point of regional government. And to mix some metaphors, if we're building a stool where one leg is data, then another leg is narrative and stories. And this isn't novel and new either. Humans respond to stories. You could call it propaganda or generational deprogramming, but what we need desperately are regional narratives that present images and messages sustained over time, year after year, decade over decade, with this North Star, regional government. It highlights relatable scenes that another Metro Detroit is possible, and how folks have a place in it. I've always liked billboards. People joke to me about this one in District Detroit sometimes. I used to dream with Kurt Metzger, who is formerly of Data Driven Detroit, who've also done great work over the years around dynamic mapping. These are some screen grabs of Neil Halloran's pieces on YouTube, where he disseminates information about ideas that are very big and hard to wrap your head around, on things like war and climate change. So, this effort probably has a place on the web, social media as well. But the point is, it depicts a place that's not too far from the place we know today, but one that's designed for a different environment in a fundamentally different way, where people can see how providing more opportunity for more of their neighbors means communities that are not only equitable, but also more dynamic and economically diverse, and ultimately more viable. It could be a very powerful and real change that changes the tenor of our conversation and our relationship to one another as a region. So, of course, the third leg is leadership. Here's some pictures of kids at Detroit Prep. Over time, these are the sort of, this is a generation I think that we're targeting, where they become more amenable to the idea of regional government, and maybe even get out in front of the rest of us, because that's what political leaders do. Um, and that's also a story as old as time. I like the picture on the right where I think that the kids might be creating images of themselves being super people in a city, which is sort of apropos. But without suddenly finding ourselves living under a different flag, which, just to remember, has happened before. Um, Unfortunately, it's likely that it will be some form of ad hoc incrementalism. Also, unless the idea becomes central to a Michigan Constitutional Convention, and that could happen too. We vote every 16 years on that. The next time I think is 2026, which would mark 100 years since Detroit last annexed parts of Redford Township, the part of town where I grew up. But I believe it's more urgent. So in closing, I just want to say it's been heartbreaking this week to see so many Detroiters impacted by the recent flooding. You've probably seen many pictures you probably know, or I hate to say this, but are even impacted yourselves. And I'm really sorry. We personally were very lucky. I know many people suffered losses. And my presentation from previously had climate change sort of as the final step in this, and then that's really come home in real ways. Yet, despite the impact of the historic storms, Detroit is a place that will, relatively speaking, make out better in an era of climate change. And I know it seems, maybe perverse this past week, especially, but it's also a place where we've got incredible access to drinkable water, where it's abundant. In just 30 years, global climate change will likely put untold pressure on upwards of 150 million people. And these are people living in places unlike Detroit, where conditions will become unmanageable to the point of making them uninhabitable, or even disappearing altogether. And what if Detroit, and you can see here, this is a projection from a great piece that I'll also put a link into. You can see Detroit being part of the country that will be slightly more habitable than other parts. So what if Detroit, a city once holding 2 million people and projected to be less detrimentally impacted by these forces, could stir a different kind of conversation, one directed at getting ahead of the climate crisis using regional cooperation, rebuilding and retrofitting our aging infrastructure to better manage the kind of historic rainfall event that happened, or even building long dreamed of public works projects, subways, for example, or rail. What if the urgency of the climate crisis is an opportunity to reform local government in Metro Detroit? Acknowledging this and acting on it, looking outward and past local differences, may be even a beacon to the rest of the world. It could be incredibly inspiring and useful for humankind. Or, what about even setting a discrete target where we as a region create a framework to welcome like 1% of the world's climate refugees, including those from other parts of the United States, I would guess. I think that would be a pretty wonderful and hopeful way to begin to reimagine life in Detroit. That said, I certainly realize that the Detroit of today has a mountain of challenges, including the fact that the Detroit of today operates in a regional context that confines it to parochialism and self-rule that is inequitable and doesn't adequately serve the needs of citizens. I would submit, though, that to get to that place where we can look out to a world that's more hopeful, where we think about prosperity and sustainable growth for at least the greatest number of us, we need to create a local government system with a broader charge that is also looking to get us there together as a region. So that's all I got. Thank you very much. These are broad strokes, and this is something that, like I said, is very much a work in progress. I'm gonna close out and, oh wait, there's one more. Oh yeah. Please comment, questions, suggestions. I'm going to, oh yeah, and there were pictures of babies in the other one. Okay, next steps, task force. Hold on, let me stop sharing. So it's 3:40. That actually wasn't as bad as I had last hoped as far as timing. Um, I did not look at the chat. I'm very sorry, but I'm going back up. But maybe if people want to, I'd love to hear from you. And if people want to raise hands or just speak out, sort of one at a time, that would also be fine. But I'd love to get some feedback.
I mean, I'll jump in. First, Francis,
Hi.
great presentation and thanking people together and framing it as you did. I always start thinking about, well, what are next steps? And I think, as I put in the chat, that we do have the Great Lakes Water Authority, which is ostensibly a regional form of governance that is interesting, both from a historical perspective for teaching purposes and letting people think about it. It is a unit that exists already, so you're not trying to make something up from scratch, but it is also deeply broken, in my opinion, especially through a lens of racial equity. I mean, I think it'd be an interesting exercise to think what people in this room could do using that as a sustained focus in being both particular, but also raising these broader issues of regionalism.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. So your idea that it exists and could be muted towards a more equitable frame within its current structure.
Or restructured.
Can I
Restructure, yeah. Thank you.
can I jump in on that? This
Sure.
is Jody, because I'm at New Detroit now, but when I was at the Herb Family Foundation, we spent a bit of work on this. And so, GLEWA, they're almost like SEMCOG to work with in a way, right? I mean, they don't really know how to work with communities. So you really gotta try. So I think there's kind of there's a door that's been opened there, but I think it's a really tough road to go. So we had at Herb, we were convening environmental groups and universities and some others. We had this green infrastructure work group, and we brought GLEWA in to talk about their wastewater master plan, which was the first time, and it's still pretty new, it's not even a year old, to talk about a regional wastewater master plan. So that was kind of an inroad to start to say, talk to them about, because they said they wanted, quality of life, and like they had more than just water quality goals. So there's kind of an opportunity maybe to continue that conversation. We tried to have input into that plan and have a conversation with them around it. And then they turned around and created, some listening sessions. And it's a lot like SEMCOG, where they're listening, but they're not really. But I'm always a big believer in if there's a crack, you just keep pushing your way through that. So if there's anyone here that wants to, push that, yeah, there's an opportunity there, I think. They say, like everyone, they care about equity and they care about, regionalism and being user friendly and all that, but they don't know how to do it. So
Thank you. That's very helpful. I didn't know a lot of that. Thank you. Anyone else? Or any other thoughts on that? I don't know.
I'll put something in the chat about, I'll try to dig up the link to the group they created.
Thank you. If anybody wants to jump in, feel free. I'm going to put a link on what I'm calling my short regionalism survey, which is a sort of follow-up. It does have a space for, if you want to, it gives you a range of options if you want to pursue this conversation. Like I said at the onset, I would love to follow up with all of you just as friends and colleagues, and it's great to see so many folks in any event. But if you're specifically interested in this topic, in terms of coming to another thing like this, or actively talking about it as sort of a next step kind of endeavor, please fill that out. And it also has some feedback about what you think about regionalism, and I'd be interested to hear from you from that perspective as well. Wow, the chat just went all by, and I'm doing a terrible job of moderating it. I'm usually the one that's just looking at it, so I'm trying to go up to the top of where that started. Okay, people guessing, that's good. government inefficiency. The Huron-Clinton Metropolitan Authority, that's also a good example. Thanks, Joel.
This is Nina Kelly. I actually work
Hi.
at the HCMA.
Go ahead, respond to that.
Yeah, and actually that's something I threw in the chat as well, that I think convening as a starting point, folks mentioned GLEWA, but I think a convening of all the regional authorities would be interesting. When you put the Metro Parks, you put the Zoo Authority, you put the DIA, you put SMART in there, you have a lot of different interests that blended together would be an interesting conversation as a starting point.
Yep. Do you have perspective on how, and I don't know if you don't have to speak necessarily on behalf, but just in terms of how these kinds of discussions might happen, or is there space for, like, in terms of comparing it to what we were just talking about with the Great Lakes Water Authority, how would you handle something like this?
Yeah, here, I'll get on camera. I don't want to speak for
No, I understand.
HCMA, obviously, but I am a proponent of regionalism, and I think that we are in our way trying to figure this out from a parks perspective. Obviously, we're a different kind of authority because we have actual land holdings in certain specific areas, but our parks are located in areas that are not accessible to a large chunk of the inner core of our region. So we're trying to figure out ways to be able to get people to our parks, through transit, through trail connections, through a variety of different ways. And I think that's how we're trying to address it. I think that there's a lot of interest right now in our organization about talking about regionalism and talking about connectivity. It comes up all the time. And we're trying to do a lot to figure out how we can better serve the residents of the city of Detroit in particular, because we don't have land in the city of Detroit. So I think the timing is good from our agency's perspective.
Okay, that's very helpful. It's yeah, go ahead, whoever that is. And I see a hand up as well.
It's Jan Anderson.
Hi.
I appreciate the comments about and from HCMA. I think it's a perfect example. I do think the GLEWA example is a good one, but parks, open space, environment, a regional perspective from this group would say, hey, what if HCMA was the provider rather than just competing with a whole, matrix of local providers? So we could envision that and look at, here's what it would cost, here's what they could do, here's what that fully realized regional model would look like. I think that's an interesting way to start, rather than start with, hey, here's one regional boundary for all public services,
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. Thank you.
The other thing I might throw in there is when we talk about regional entities, they're not necessarily authorities, but thinking about the watershed models. And, our agency was named after the Huron River and the Clinton River, but we've got the Rouge River in there as well. And these watersheds cross municipal boundaries also. And it speaks to that point about climate and climate change and water in general and what the future might look like. I mean, we already see how easily things like PFAS chemicals travel throughout a watershed at a rapid pace. So I think bringing those perspectives into the conversation would also be worthwhile.
Great.
If I could just add one thing, that one opportunity we might recognize, and that is the possibility of major new funding for infrastructure being enacted sometime in the next year. This could represent a tremendous opportunity, I think, to push the system to use those dollars in ways that address some of the concerns that have already been raised about climate change and about equity. And in the past, it's been so difficult to make progress, and I've flattened the top of my head banging against the wall on this for a number of years because of scarcity, because everybody can just say, well, you know, we can barely keep our communities open. What are you talking to us about, you know, these big ideas? But if we've got, you know, the possibility of some major new funding coming in, we could, I mean, I think we could start to open up a lot of conversations about regional equity and climate change and what we're doing with these huge sums of money. And are we simply going to pour more money into failed systems, or are we going to challenge regional structures like SEMCOG, which are really endowed with enormous amounts of power that most people have no idea just how much influence SEMCOG's forecasts and SEMCOG's you know, authority, the MPO that's really part of SEMCOG, how much they're really able to determine where money goes. And you know, I think there's all kinds of strategies that might be mounted, and there are a lot of people in this meeting, I think, who could contribute meaningfully to starting that conversation now and maybe putting us in a position to do something about it if and when that money comes along.
Yeah, just anecdotally, I've been talking to some folks who are consulting and working with Wayne County, and just their discovery of where different communities are with their planning agencies, or is like the discrepancies between communities is huge, and being able to just talk the same language is a huge mountain, even when a community is just on the other side of the road. So there's not a system to even as you are getting at, you know, meaningfully disperse these dollars in good ways. A couple of people have had their hand up, so that's also what I want to recognize. Feel free to. This is great conversation. So I saw Nick's hand first, and then Jeff's.
I just wanted to chime in and say one thing about a premise, and then an observation about the history of regionalism in Detroit. So for me, Francis, a difference in how I see this problem than you do is that actually for some communities, fragmentation is incredibly efficient. It is an opportunity to concentrate and hoard tax base. And it's a really useful way to basically make sure that you have your tax structure and your services working in incredible efficiency to raise property values. And so getting around that problem, and for other communities, of course, what it is a problem where all of those external costs are concentrated in there. And I think Detroit is sort of a perfect case study of that. And so the question for me has always been like, how do you get over that like differential problem for different communities? So the historical point that I wanted to make, when I look at this in Detroit, what I see is a series of kind of one-off negotiations about regionalism. So 1926, the HCMA, in the 1970s, like desegregation and busing. Now it's sort of transit. I think LIWA you could think of as a one-off negotiation. Historically, communities that have actually done regionalism have found ways to sort of bundle things that are useful to communities that efficiently fragment. So things like sewers, things like commercial tax-based sharing, things that they cannot get, and bundle those with issues that cities that suffer under fragmentation also care about. So things like housing and transit. And I just wonder, like, why that conversation hasn't happened in Detroit. I'm not trying to advocate that that's the scale of ambition that has to happen now. But I see that as the successful model and one that hasn't worked in Detroit to date.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. It's not lost on me, but also I agree that that's some, you know, I guess I'm more naive in some ways about how government should function, but thank you for that. Jeff, and then, oh, Vince, I see also. So Jeff and Vince.
Hey, Francis, this is Jeffrey. I'm reposting in the chat something I put in earlier. Before I moved back to Michigan, I was at the Metropolitan Planning Council as a research assistant, and we specifically looked at government efficiency. So if you click that link, it will take you to something like 8 to 12 case studies on consolidation and collaboration and other means of people coming together. I think that might be helpful. The one I worked on back in the day was not sexy, but it was exciting. I think I wrote my piece on DuPage Water Commission and DuPage Housing Authority and how Ultimately, DuPage County employed an independent contractor to review the financial and operational structures and procurement and ethics policies of 24 of its independent government taxing agencies. And by doing this analysis, they ended up saving like millions and millions of dollars for the region. Not that interested in that topic these days, but I support you if you go down that rabbit hole. The other thing I would say is
Any rabbit holes on this one?
Yeah, the other thing I would say is really specific to disability, disaster preparation, and emergency response. You know, as my role as policy director for Detroit Disability Power, we really hit our head against the wall many times this last year and a half with government not factoring in people with disabilities in regards to the response to the pandemic. And at the end of the day, the vaccine rollout really came down to how these 64 counties were going to get it done, and how state government and federal government were going to support that, making it real. And where I think, you know, an opportunity exists for regional response from an organization that takes responsibility and leadership in such a vein where the state did not, is you have then an opportunity to fill a gap such as, you know, not every county put together accessible policies and accessible guidance for all the different places that offered shots in arms within their jurisdiction. And so we would go to Oakland County and teach them. We go to Macomb County and teach them. We go to Washtenaw County and teach them. And we have to work with the county government, the health department, and ultimately we really wanted the state to take responsibility and set guidance and spread it to all 64 counties, which never happened. And so to this day, I can tell you that we're going to release a survey product pretty soon that says, you know, a lot of counties just didn't get it done in terms of accessibility. And if we do not see a lot of people with disabilities having received the vaccine, it's not necessarily based upon individual responsibility. It's also based upon systemic failure to know what to do, how to do it, and do it with sufficient disability etiquette. So regionally, that was a huge mess up and something we're still working to straighten out, and it has severe consequences.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Jeff. Great stuff. I'll definitely check that link out. Vince, I don't see anybody else's hand up.
Hey, Francis.
Hi. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no, thanks for doing this. I mean, I appreciate the fact that no windmill is ever safe from you. And I remember the first time talking about this a long time ago. You're still raising the concern, and it is an issue. Something Jan said in the chat kind of connected with me in terms of you know, looking at the opportunities for regional cooperation where there's sort of less resistance. And one thing that occurs to me that's happening that might fall in that category is new areas of intergovernmental cooperation that are emerging. And one of the sectors where that's happening is in the space of mobility innovation. I put that out there just to say, maybe there's a way. Don't get me wrong. I see the necessity on climate change and various other issues, but I wonder if there's less institutional opposition to a brand new sort of clean slate effort, one in which you have to have multiple units of government coordinating on permitting and licensing for different kinds of autonomous vehicle allowances and infrastructure, which also has the benefit of being pushed, at least in the near term, by pretty heavy hitters on the corporate side. I mean, that's where Ford's a mobility company now, and Google's interested and partnered with MDOT on a pilot project that connects between Ann Arbor and Detroit. And so you have already the need to sort of force cooperation between the public-private sector as well as intergovernmentally, right down to the street level. You know, what does the end user think about it? So put that out there as a potential way, getting behind maybe some effort where you could put out a model of regional cooperation and show its benefits that has that
Sky regional
potential. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
just a thought.
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought about it like that, and that's helpful. Thank you. It's 4 o'clock. I am happy to stay on. I want to say it's done. This is done. I know. I see people have already started going to other meetings. This is not meant to be a happy hour into the July 4th weekend. I do want to respect your time. I'm happy to stay on for a few extra minutes if anybody had a burning question or comment. But really, I would love to follow up with you all on this. Please fill out that poll, which I did send. I can put it again in the chat. Here, 1 second. And yeah, and let's continue the conversation. Anyone else just want to jump in before we sign off? We've fulfilled your regionalism quota for the day. Awesome. Here's the link again, I think, and please click on it and spend. It should be just a few minutes. I'd love to get your feedback. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming out today. Enjoy your weekend. I will use this list as a starting point to say hello to everybody in real time starting today. So thanks so much.
Thanks.